Good morning in beautiful Maastricht. My name is Tom van Veen. I'm acting pro-rector of this university and the chair of this ceremony. And hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Vinzenz Peters will defend the academic thesis Economic Resilience to Physical Climate Shocks, the Roles of Financial and Firm Structures. May I invite you, Vinzenz, to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis in 15 minutes.
Dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the Corona, dear colleagues, family and friends, it's my great pleasure to present you my dissertation titled Economic Resilience to Physical Climate Shocks, the Roles of Financial and Firm Structures. The starting point, and in a way the motivation for my research over the past 4 years, is a rather grim observation. When physical climate shocks, such as extreme storms or floods, coincide with human activity, the consequences are often disastrous. Knowing that climate change will make these shocks worse, it has become a topic of major public and policy interest, how we can safeguard human and economic progress in the face of disasters. And this means the question is, how can we become more resilient to physical climate shocks? And the first thing that might come to mind here is physical infrastructure. If we just build higher dikes, we will be able to tame nature. Well, it is certainly true that physical infrastructure is important. It does not appear realistic that we will be able to reduce damages completely and prevent any losses from occurring. Therefore, we also need to think about how we can make our economic systems themselves more resilient. In other words, how can we strengthen economic resilience? What do I mean by this term? Well, in the context of my thesis, I define economic resilience as the ability of economies, businesses, or communities to withstand, adapt to, and recover from all sorts of shocks, disruptions, or stresses. These can be physical climate shocks, disasters, can also be financial crises or COVID-19 pandemic, with the overall goal to minimize the occurring losses. Now, economic resilience, it's a nice term, but after all, it's still really a rather complex construct, and it consists of many defining features. Some of these features are already better understood, and there's been a lot of research about them. About others, we still know relatively little. And in my PhD research, I've focused on 2 aspects of economic resilience that have received relatively little attention so far. The first one is local financial structure, and the second one is local firm structure. And I've studied both of these aspects in a series of case studies focusing on different parts of the world, including China, the United States, and Europe. I do emphasize the word local here because, in contrast to other types of shocks, such as financial crisis or a pandemic, physical climate shocks are typically very localized. It may be that one city is really heavily affected and experiencing large damages, while a neighboring city can be pretty much left unharmed. And therefore, it is really important to get a very granular and local understanding of what is going on. The importance of local financial structure in this context becomes apparent when we start considering that firms and households need money to rebuild destroyed houses or rebuild destroyed shops, or to bridge income losses that occur because people cannot work for some time. Insurance, savings, or government aids can help, but often there's still a gap remaining. And in these situations, people can go to their bank and ask for a loan. So what we do observe after physical climate shocks is that the demand for loans or the demand for credit goes up. It is much less clear what happens to the supply of loans. Does the bank, in the end, provide the loan for you to rebuild your house? This is much less clear because we know from previous research that different types of banks behave differently, and not all banks respond to this request in the same way. For instance, banks may have different ownership structures and, as a consequence, different objectives. Some banks, for instance, state-owned or local banks, often have a mission to support their local communities. Other banks, like large private banks, for instance, may be primarily focused on maximizing profits for the shareholders and may be less willing to lend in risky or economically challenging times. Similarly, the way that banks do their business may matter. So two opposing business models in a kind of stylized fashion are so-called transaction banking and relationship banking. Transaction banks are usually large and centralized institutions that offer standardized services, such as credit based on a credit score. These banks are considered fast and efficient in what they're doing, but they are rather impersonal. In contrast, relationship banks are smaller and local. They gather personal information through face-to-face contacts and long-term personal relationship with their customers. This is considered a more traditional and maybe less efficient way of banking, but it does allow these banks to have a deeper understanding of who their borrowers are. And with this in mind, the first part of my thesis focuses on the question, what role does local financial structure and in particular banking structure play in economic resilience to physical climate shocks? So while local financial structure may play a role, at the end of the day it's local firms that are the actual backbone of the local economy. They are the ones providing jobs and determining the livelihood of a local community. Among these local firms, we know from previous research that younger and smaller firms tend to be more vulnerable to all sorts of shocks. They are typically less diversified because of their small size, they have fewer redundancies, and they are typically highly dependent on local market conditions. On the other hand, there is a bit of a different strand of research suggesting that the characteristics that predict the success of young and small firms are also predictors of resilience in psychology research. I mean here that successful entrepreneurs are typically more flexible, more adaptive, and they are kind of more used to act under pressure and uncertainty. And this may, on the other hand, help firms that are faced with crises. These two opposing aspects raise the question to the overall effect of these young and small firms for local economic resilience during physical climate shocks. Next to these kind of regional characteristics of firms, the financing decisions that the firm itself have made may influence firm-level resilience. As one aspect of this, the decision or potentially also the ability of firms, how much debt they have used to finance their growth in non-crisis times may have consequences for their resilience in times when they are affected by shocks. And by combining these two aspects, I get the second main research question of my dissertation. What role does local firm structure, in particular local entrepreneurship and pre-shock debt, play in economic resilience to physical climate shocks? How do I attempt to answer these questions? Well, to explain it in a kind of simplified, slightly stylized way, what we do is we measure economic resilience in terms of some economic outcome, such as output or employment, and we look at the development of affected regions, banks, or firms over time. So consider in this graph some economic outcome, such as employment. Employment may be growing over time steadily until at some point a physical climate shock occurs, a flood, a storm that affects the local community. Typically what we see then is instead of continuing on the previous growth path, the employment might go down, right? It experiences a dip and it takes some time to get back up to the previous trend. And what kind of how we measure, how we approach economic resilience here is we ask how deep does the economic outcome drop and how fast does it recover? And we try to explain what we observe in this respect with local financial structure and local firm structure. What are the core results that I found in my dissertation? In the first study focusing on China, we find that having more large state-owned banks increases the economic resilience of prefecture-level cities. How do these banks achieve this? We think in two ways. First, because of their large size, they're able to rechannel funds from one corner of the country to a region that has been affected by a disaster. Secondly, they are also very likely to do so because of their state ownership. They have a mission to support the development and the resilience of the local economy, and they do seem to act upon it. In contrast, in a second case study focusing on US counties, we find that local community banks are positively associated with economic resilience. We show in our study that these banks continue to lend to local businesses that are affected by extreme weather events, where large private banks seem to pull out credit, at least for a certain period of time. This suggests that the relationships that these local banks have with these community really provide a benefit in terms of greater resilience. Taken together as a more generalized result, this implies that having banks that are both willing and able to provide credit during shocks improves the economic resilience of affected entities. Turning to local firm structure, first, again in a case study of US counties, we show that regions with more young and small firms are actually more resilient to shocks. We argue that this is due to the resilience benefits that these entrepreneurs and the more active entrepreneurial environment provides to these local economies. Next to this, in a study focusing on the firm level within Europe, so European small and medium-sized enterprises, we find that SMEs with a moderate amount of debt are actually the most resilient. So when you look at the graph from left to right, SMEs with very little debt appear to be relatively less resilient, especially if they don't have access to long-term financing. And SMEs with very high levels of debt appear less resilient. So bringing these two chapters together, we can conclude that individual firms can be vulnerable, and this may partly depend on the level of debt that they had previously to the shock, but that a more active entrepreneurial community, more active entrepreneurial environment in a region can enhance the overall regional resilience. So to conclude and bring this all together, in a nutshell, what do we learn from this research? With respect to economic resilience and local financial structure, we see that the ownership structure and the business models of banks that are available to a local economy affect economic resilience. And considering this in a broader context raises some concerns. Because what we observe in the real world is that these resilience-enhancing banks, the state-owned banks in China and the community banks in the United States, are increasingly losing market shares to private banks, which are typically more profit-driven and, as I said, often considered more efficient. While this development may promise greater profits to these banks in normal times, it does seem to hurt local economies that are hit by physical climate shocks. Considering economic resilience and local firm structure, we find that regions that manage to have more young and small firms, that is, more local entrepreneurs, are more resilient, which gives rise to demands of supporting local entrepreneurs in some way or the other. And next to this, we find that among the small firms, having some access to debt can help build firm-level resilience, but excessive reliance on debt seems to hurt these firms. And this is interesting if you consider that debt is treated or receives a preferential treatment in many major economies around the world, for instance, in terms of tax systems, because this suggests that these privileges create some distortions that lead to firms and communities being less resilient than they could be when they're faced with a shock. Thank you very much for your attention. I give the word back to the Pro-Rector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Bos, Professor of Banking and Finance at Maastricht University, and Professor Bos was chair of the assessment committee of this thesis.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, welcome to the eye of the storm. So my question is about treatment. So imagine that you're a local Texas business owner and you're driving to your business, and a meteorologist comes on the radio and he announces that a storm, force 9, is going to hit in 48 hours. 2.5 days later, the storm arrives, force 8, and when you arrive at your business after the storm, you record the immediate losses, which actually are more similar to a force 10 storm. And since President Trump has cut funding for FEMA, 3 months later your business is still destroyed. Now, according to your thesis, as a local Texas business owner, this means that you're being treated. The question is, what is treatment exactly in this story? Is it when the meteorologist comes to the radio? Is it when the storm arrives? Is it immediately after the storm? Is it 3 months later? What is treatment and when is treatment? In chapter 4, it seems that it's more the losses that I find, maybe immediately. In chapters 2 and 3, it would be more maybe when the meteorologist comes on the radio. So I would like to hear from you what you think treatment actually is in this context. Mm-hmm. I look forward to your answer.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this excellent question. Really puts the finger into one of the core challenges that I came across during my research journey here. What is the treatment? And related to this, I think the question is, what is economic resilience and what are we resilient to? So as you alluded to in the first chapter of my thesis focusing on China, we use wind speeds and precipitation, so what the meteorologist says as the treatment, whereas in later papers we use the damages as treatment. There are some trade-offs that need to be considered. I can first of all admit that the actual choice in my research was largely, or to a large extent, driven by the data that we had available. Also having in mind the granularity of the data that we could use. And so the considerations that you have to do there are that the wind speed and for instance, the precipitation are considered exogenous. So what I mean by that is that the local economy does not have a direct influence on how fast the speed is of the wind that comes and how destructive it might be. But what matters at the end for the firms, the taxi business owner, is how much is actually destroyed. So it can be that there is a category 10 storm, but he had all his cars in a garage and was lucky not to experience any damage at all. So the thing that's going to hurt him at the end is the if you want, the monetarized damage that affects his business. So from a resilience standpoint, I think the question is the physical aspect, the meteorological aspect, how much damage does occur when there's a given wind speed. But from an economic resilience aspect, I would say that to show your economic resilience, a shock has to be occurred that has affected you economically. So there, probably the actual damage that occurred is the better, I don't want to say ideal, but the better treatment to get an answer to the concept that we were after there.
A very brief follow-up question. You just have to answer yes or no, just out of curiosity. Because it's an intriguing answer. So let's say that I'm hit by a shock and I don't have any damages because I was prepared. Am I then resilient? Yes or no?
Yes, physically resilient. I don't know economically resilient.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Botsten, Professor of the Economics of Climate Change and Natural Disasters at the Free University of Amsterdam and Professor of the Economics of Global Environmental Change at Utrecht University. Professor Botsten was member of the assessment committee of this thesis and he is online with us.
So dear candidates, so first of all, I'd like to give you my compliments for this high-quality PhD thesis. But I'm here to ask questions about it, and I have a question about chapter 5. So, like you also explained in your presentation in this chapter, you assume that the impacts of natural disasters on firms may be related to entrepreneurship, and that is a degree of entrepreneurship can be proxied by the share of employment in young and small firms. And I wonder if that is really a good indicator for entrepreneurship in the context of natural disaster shocks. Because, for instance, these younger firms may have a different capital and technological structure than older firms. And we, for instance, know that firms with, very high capital stock, and for instance, advanced technologies like more heavy industries, once they're hit by, for instance, a flood disaster, they have very long economic recovery times. And the impacts on employment will then also be much larger than, for instance, for younger firms. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on this? So do you think this is really a good proxy for entrepreneurship? Or are you capturing something else with that variable?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this great question. And it's indeed a good question, because what you're alluding to is certainly right. So young and small firms might have, for instance, also different capital structure than larger firms. And young and small firms, it is a very broad category, a very large group of firms also that could fall under this categorization, especially the small firms part. The young firms share, as we define it, is rather small. Unfortunately, with the data that we had available for this project, we considered this aspect, but the firm level capitalization was nothing that we could really get our hands on here. So this might be an aspect playing a role that we cannot entirely eliminate from the data, or based on the data that we had available. However, I think that this still offers some, interesting conclusions or interesting insights for, people that are considered or that care about local economic resilience. So if it is indeed then more beneficial to have these firms because they use less capital, maybe because they are, digital startups or something like that is probably what you kind of have in mind with this. Then from a regional planner's point of view, this might also be one lever that they could use to achieve greater local economic resilience. Of course, not every region can have only startups, and this is just a partial kind of aspect that we picked out and that we looked into. So what we would recommend based on this chapter is not the complete solution to the question of regional economic resilience, but yeah, I think it's kind of, from that perspective, it can still be the right way to go to try to, protect and support these local firms, not only because they are more entrepreneurial and have these benefits, but also maybe because they diversify the local industrial structure.
All right, thank you for your answer and reflection on this assumption.
Continued by Professor Millock, Professor of Economics at the Paris School of Economics. Professor Millock was member of the assessment committee of the thesis, and she's available, or she's with us online.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being online. I'm very happy to be here, and I'd like to compliment you for the high quality of your dissertation. I have a question, and my question is about spatial spillovers. I'd like to get back to the question on how you measure the economic outcomes and what could be the role of spatial spillovers. You talk about networks for the big state-owned banks in your analysis of local financial structure, Chapter 3 in China, and you talk about branch networks of community banks in Chapter 4 in the US. But my question is more about the spillovers of the physical shocks that you are studying. In particular, when you look at the impact of local firms, because we know in a lot of the literature on weather impacts that it's not always the firms or individuals that are directly impacted that matter, but also the indirect effects through the economy. So I didn't see really explicit mention of this. You mention it in the literature review, but in your own work, could you elaborate a bit on how you would like to maybe investigate in depth the role of spillovers of the physical weather shocks? Thank you.
A highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this question. Spillover effects are indeed, as you say, an important aspect here. Nothing that we have really focused on too much or that I have focused on too much in my research so far. You gotta cut it short at some point and cannot investigate everything. But I'm very happy to think a little bit about it and reflect about it. You first mentioned the aspect of banks. I briefly want to say something about it because I think that's very interesting, that what we can learn from there. As you say, in the China paper with the large banks, the network banks, they created resilience, and we think it's partly because of their network and they can reallocate funds to that economy. The community banks in the US are largely independent small banks, so potentially their benefits could be even greater if they were also implemented better in like a greater regional network. From the firm's perspective, so we did not, I think in the context of my thesis, the question would primarily be how spillover effects would then have benefits again for the local economy of the affected region. Right, so when we talk about spillovers, it might be, or what typically happens, what you might have in mind is that the neighboring regions that were unaffected, they see an uptick in economic activity because demand is redirected to those regions, and they can help and step in and take over some of the work that affected businesses cannot do. But what consequence would or does that have when that happens for the resilience of those regions that are directly affected? I think it can be twofold. So with these positive spillovers in the first place, it can be that indeed if you have a well-working economic system next to you, this can be supportive for your own recovery if there are the right type of businesses, construction business for instance, with the capacity to, rebuild the infrastructure and the houses that you need. So having the right capacity might be then a positive effect. It could also be that through spillovers, the directly affected communities can be affected more negatively if what would be happening is that economic activity goes elsewhere and it stays there. It does not come back to the directly affected community. In this case, the recovery would be slowed down and we'd see more prolonged negative economic impacts. Yeah, I think this would be kind of my starting point, how I would think about it, building on the literature that already exists.
Thank you.
Opposition will be continued by Professor Kool, Professor of Macroeconomics and International Monetary Economics at Maastricht University. Professor Kool was also a member of the assessment committee of this thesis, and also Professor Clemens Kool is available online.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, let me add to the compliments made by my predecessors. I enjoyed reading your thesis, which is a nice product. But let me directly go to my question. So it relates to the previous questions in a way, because many questions already have addressed the measurement issue. So looking at treatment effects, etc. So I would like to take a slightly different approach. So when I look at your literature review in chapter 2, then you start from natural hazard shocks as a sort of phenomenon on their own, and then you have all sorts of econometric tricks to measure them. The question is that the best approach, and did you consider, and suppose you would consider an alternative, how would that work out? And I'm pointing to the macroeconomic shock literature, where we start typically from a sort of a theoretical assumptions that there's only a limited amount of structural shocks in the economy. And what we see in GDP or unemployment is the mix of shocks that hits in a specific time period. And then depending on the characteristics of these structural shocks, we can identify them doing an econometric analysis. And the fundamental shocks then typically are supply shocks, demand shocks, monetary policy shocks. Each of these have their own, let's say, constant characteristics and transmission through the economy. Now, would you argue that natural hazard shocks form another separate category of structural shocks? So is there, next to a supply and a demand shock, is there a standard natural hazard shock? And if so, how would you identify that compared to these other shocks? Or would you argue that natural hazard shocks essentially are sort of a time-varying mix of supply and demand shocks or other structural shocks? But if that is the case, how could you then expect or explain stable impulse response functions of what are time-varying mix of underlying shocks? And what would be the added value of having a separate natural hazard shock? So I'm looking forward to your reflection on these two options.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this interesting question. Reflecting on these two different options or perspectives on this matter, I think the answer is going to be a bit of both. So you would say, okay, well, natural hazard shocks, what happens is that infrastructure is destroyed, right? Industry, shops, houses. It's clearly, I would say, affecting supply, right? If the local businesses are interrupted and cannot work for some time. But, you know, through the impact on consumers and, you know, households, is clearly also affecting demand. So it's a bit of both. What, from my point of view, makes natural hazard shocks stand apart from, for instance, a financial crisis or a business cycle trial is two things, I believe. First of all, it's very localized nature, right? So financial crisis typically affects the entire economy, whereas a storm or a flood often has very clearly delimited fringes, and it does affect one city but not another. Which then from the macroeconomic perspective from which you're coming leads to different implications, because then these kind of spillover effects, for instance, can play a different role than when you're considering a truly macroeconomic shock. Secondly, natural hazard shocks are different to a financial crisis, to a pandemic, really because of this physical impact that they have, right? So the financial crisis does not destroy any machinery. It does not destroy houses. It might mean that the people who owned the house cannot live in it anymore, but it does not destroy the actual asset. And this leads to this very unique requirement to replace lost capital, which in this literature is also considered in interesting ways, because there's some research suggesting that these might even lead to updating old machinery, old equipment, and therefore becoming more productive because now you have new machinery. The empirical evidence on this is a little bit mixed, but it is a theoretical thing that we could think about. So I think it's these two unique features of natural hazard shocks that make them stand apart and differentiate them from the maybe more classical macroeconomic shocks that you alluded to.
If I'm allowed, Pro-Rector, can you spend one sentence in explaining then if you think they are unique and not, let's say, replicatable by demand and supply shocks, how you would identify them compared to the standard supply and demand shocks?
So, well, empirically, through the event and by mapping the regional impact that we see onto the firms and the regions that are affected, if that answers your question.
I think we need to continue that at a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Pizzilio, Assistant Professor of Economics at Maastricht University, and Dr. Pizzilio was member of the assessment committee of the thesis.
Dear Vinzenz, congratulations on a really interesting, insightful, and very well-written thesis. I have a question on Europe. You have studied many areas, so your chapter 6 is on Europe. It's not only because of the geographical area, it's also because of what you find empirically. You find that firms, small and medium enterprises, are really not so hurt by having long-term debt. I find this really quite brilliant that you study that, because in fact, distalized facts, as far as I know, was not found before for this type of firms, for this location, and especially for the type of shocks that you look at. However, it has a very strong, I think, policy implication, and I would like to focus on that. It is the case in the finance literature that we know that maturity of debt of firms is in fact affected by the sale of maturity of debt of governments. This is true in the US, and more recently it's been found out also for the euro area. For the euro area, there is a tricky stylized fact that says that governments basically borrowing at long-term maturity in one government actually affect firms in another country within the Eurozone. So there are Euro area integration issues. And here you have a nice, I think, a policy trade-off, and I would like you to reflect on that. Because indeed, if a country in the Eurozone can borrow at long-term maturity, and that is in a way affecting and sort of nudging the firms all over the Euro area to borrow with more short-term maturity, which according to your research is an issue, right? It affects their economic resilience in times of climate shocks. How do we go about this? And you have very nice policy implications already. So that's why I wanted to reflect a little bit on this, without necessarily getting to an answer, by the way. Just I was looking forward to your reflection. Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this interesting question. It does indeed require a moment to reflect on this. So let me just think out loud, I believe. Because how you summarized it is indeed true. So our results suggest that, giving SMEs more, or enabling them to access more long-term, more maybe stable financing, increases their resilience, pretty much because the hurdle that they have is then typically with short-term financing, the refinancing of the debt after the shock when they're in a bad position and their collateral has been destroyed and so on. I assume that there are many ways in which policymakers could nudge or could create an environment in which SMEs would be able to access more long-term debt. I have to admit, I don't know how strong this trade-off is, with government bonds. How large this effect is, how significant it is.
Even without going that far in how strong it is, what would be the considerations you would make in that? Would you consider tying up the European governments in the name of saving the firms from climate shocks?
I mean, there would be some benefits for governments, right? Because what we see is that the government, when thinking about climate shocks, they're often considered like the lender of last resort, or the insurance of last resort. If firms are not insured and they cannot get a loan from their bank, we hardly ever see, particularly in Europe, that the firms are left to themselves and abandoned, right? So the government will step in, at least they will say they step in, and provide government aid. So it could be one lever here that by constraining themselves with their own borrowing as countries, as governments, enabling SMEs to access more long-term debt themselves, creating a more stable funding situation through the shock for these SMEs, that this potentially reduces the need for governments to ex post step in and provide aid to directly affected firms. This could be one thing to consider here from a government perspective. But it's just a partial aspect of it, a partial reflection, I believe.
Thank you. This is a very nice reflection. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. The opposition will be continued by Professor Feldman, Watts Professor of Public Policy at Arizona State University.
Very good. So, dear candidate, building on this last question, you have written an incredibly impressive thesis. And so 4 empirical chapters and a really sound literature review, very informative. And of these 5 articles, 4 are already published. And so that is a wonderful accomplishment. But the thesis is a beginning and not an end. And so given your familiarity with data and also with different institutions, what are the critical questions that you will look at next to inform policy to increase resilience through finance?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for this question that allows me to be a little bit creative and yeah, take a little bit of a look into the future. There were, you know, as it goes with research, there were probably more loose ends at the end of the thesis than there were at the beginning. So many things I could focus on. So what would personally interest me the most, or what would probably also be the most promising in terms of projects, given that we studied this local financial structure aspect in China and the US, I think it would be very interesting to go a little bit deeper into that also for Europe, which is challenging because in Europe every country is different in that matter, and it would be a huge data task. And we also know that in Europe data availability is often not as good as elsewhere. But I think there, with the unique features of the European banking systems, there would be quite something to learn from that. Another second thing, but that is a little bit more vague to me, and I still have to think about how I'm going to approach that in future research, is this trade-off between efficiency and resilience that, you know, keeping up in basically every chapter, right? Because for the banking systems, we found, okay, the less efficient banks are the ones creating more resilience. With the entrepreneurship paper, one might argue that these young and small firms are less efficient than big and long-standing firms that have been, you know, economies of scale and are really, you know, developed to be very efficient machines, if you like, whereas young, small firms often fail, first of all, which is from a macroeconomic perspective rather inefficient. Might be, okay, provocative point, debatable, but one might say that's not as efficient. These small firms, you know, often also require slack and experimenting, and yeah, I think it's fair to say that they burn resources in doing so. Finally, also with respect to this debt chapter, debt is used for a reason, right? It receives often preferential tax treatment, and from kind of corporate finance perspective, is considered an efficient way of financing growth for firms, but it reduces resilience if used excessively. And so going even broader than this, it seems that this pattern is also found in very different contexts. So for instance, in the health sector, we seem to be on a trajectory to make our health sectors ever more efficient, reduce the capacities that we have. A nice example here is the comparison between the Netherlands and Germany during the COVID pandemic, where the Netherlands arguably had a really efficient health system, Germany not so much, but it created some benefits during the pandemic because there were more, intensive care units still available in Germany, so patients had to be brought from the Netherlands to Germany to use these slack spare facilities that are expensive and not efficient in normal times, but they helped increase resilience. And I do wonder how generalizable this point might be. And that is something that I would really, I think, enjoy looking into more in future research.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Kemp, Professor of Innovation and Sustainable Development at Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, dear Vinzenz, I also want to add to the compliments that have been expressed. I think this is a nice piece of work. I think the English is incredibly good. So I was really impressed by that. It's not only good for an economist or a German, but for any person. So you have a talent for clear writing. The question that I have is some bit of a challenge. It's because it's about what's not in the thesis, rather than in the thesis. So what I notice is that the concept of resilience that you used is actually, I looked for it. It's in a footnote. It's presented, but not really discussed. There is also no attention to other frameworks of resilience by planners and development scholars, whose work I tend to know. And then they talk about evolutionary resilience and things like building back better, which was also a mantra after the COVID crisis or the pandemic. My question is why not, make use of that or discuss this? The other question I think is that the extreme weather events occurred in regions which are prone to extreme weather events. And I wonder to what extent the event itself really changed the thinking of the actors concerned, the businesses, manufacturers, banks, also local government. In what way? Especially in a time in which there are increasingly a lot of shocks. And the COVID I already mentioned. We also had the global financial crisis. So I know you didn't study this directly, the thinking and the actual strategies, but I was hoping that you could illuminate us on that.
Given the time, and we have one more opponent to go, I prefer that you answer one question. You choose one question to answer.
A highly esteemed opponent. I think I can give short answers to both. The first question about the concept of resilience, I've spent a lot of time reading up on that entire literature about resilience indicators, and United Nations doing a lot of work on that, for instance, at the beginning of my research journey. I, in the end, went for these much more toned or much simpler measure of resilience or way of quantifying it for very practical reasons, because these resilience indicators, because resilience is such a complex construct, can bring in so many variables that for the purpose of operationalization in my empirical setups, it was easier to go for a simpler definition and a simpler way of measuring it. About how events change the thinking and basically adaptation strategies. Well, my rather unoptimistic observation in that regard is that people also tend to forget again very soon. So we do try to incorporate, general risk levels that differ across regions, because there certainly is the awareness there that risk differs across space. But at the same time, you can see, given the example of the Ahrtal flood, for instance, of which I had a picture in my slides, that also because of institutionalized factors, insurance, for instance, people build back in the same very vulnerable spaces right next to the river where their house has been washed away last time. We know that this event is going to happen again at some point. The next time might not be as severe, but it is going to happen again. And one aspect of it being that insurance only pays if you build back in the same spot, people are also kind of forced to do so. So this entire building back better idea is great, but I think we need to do more to live it more, to really act upon it more.
Thanks. The opposition will be continued by Professor Broeders, Professor of Finance at Maastricht University.
Thank you. Dear candidate, great work. My question is on Chapter 6, the sweet spot. So you claim there is an inverse relation between leverage and resilience. And although you do not provide a structural model with testable hypotheses, you do some regression analysis. And, well, that leads you to conclude that there is this optimal sweet spot. Now, first of all, before I go to that, so you define or you look at leverage, so debt over total assets. But in the descriptives, you use leverage ratio. I think it's the same, but I'm not quite sure. Anyway, the number is 0.86, which seems to be rather high to me. There's a lot of debt then that SMEs use. Anyway, my point here is that if I look at table 6.5 and 6.6, the econometric evidence is rather weak. So why do you still believe there is this optimal position in terms of leverage and also in terms of the duration of the leverage? While if I look at the quadratic term in, for instance, table 6.5, it's mostly not significant. What I think is a missed opportunity, assuming that the numbers are correct or that they are statistically significant, what is a missed opportunity is that you then calculate what the optimal sweet spot is. So I've done that myself. I used my calculator to do that, and I think it's around 0.4. So another question is, how do we get from 0.86 to 0.4? Thank you.
A highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this very concrete question. I'm tempted to ask how you calculated it, going from 0.86 to 0.4.
You just divide the two parameters.
All right.
It's
yeah.
not that.
So yeah, I think my answer would begin with the fact that this is, of course, kind of a partial analysis, right? Just focusing on this aspect of resilience, and the claim that this is a sweet spot just focuses on this partial aspect, right? So when you're making your leverage decision in general, you would have to take the broader picture as a firm, right? So it might be that the benefits that you get from the high leverage that you have, whatever it may be, in normal times, through that you're so much better off that you can kind of break even or cover up with the decreased resilience in a crisis time. So I'm not claiming that this is the sweet spot for a complete assessment of a leverage decision of a firm.
Now I must say you may finish your sentence, but I think you stopped already. So, Vinzenz Peters, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Get the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. To the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. What's on the line? I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Vinzenz Peters. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Straatmans is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. Thereafter, Professor Sanders will give the laudatio. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Please all rise.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law, and in conformity with the decision of the committee hereby present, I hereby confer upon you, Vinzenz Peters, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Sehr geehrter Herr Dr. Peters, dear Vinzenz, what an amazing trip. What an amazing trip this has been. As custom dictates, I looked up when we first met and started discussing in the mail archive, and we had to go back to 2020, when actually I also just started here in Maastricht. We started at the same date. You came in from Münster, still wrapping up your master's there, and I came back after having defended my PhD in this room ages ago. Both starting fresh in the middle of a COVID lockdown, which was, of course, a challenge. I went back into my email archives. I found over 500 emails in the last 5 years, which is testament to his communication skills and management skills of professors. And together with Stefan, we had already formulated a PhD project before I arrived here and recruited on the, I think, advice of Clemens, someone who had already been through the vetting process, and we ended up recruiting you for that. And it's been I guess, a golden pick. A very, very smooth process. From the very start, you were very proactive, you were very professional, you were very engaged. And most of all, you clearly had fun with doing the research you did and do. And I think after the usual formalities of putting together a training and supervision plan, which we never looked at again, well, I looked at it just for the fun of it, didn't really work out exactly. But what the first thing we did is work with Yincha, who came here on an exchange, and she was very happy to have that exchange, and she arrived in April 2021 in a lockdown in an empty building for a research stay. And I was really worried, how am I going to make this worthwhile for her and make it an interesting trip? And we teamed up, and you, as much as I did, you took her under your arm, and we started working together, and that resulted in the chapter on China as the first paper in your PhD. So a very productive collaboration. Then we joined with Marianne and Scott, started working on the US because we had the ambition to cover the whole world in your research, and we actually got that done. But also interestingly, so with Yin Chang, you worked with a peer, a researcher visiting from China. With Marianne and me, you had to work with senior professors who are difficult to engage in your research. Then we worked with Christian, who's a student, and that you had to really supervise. And all those roles you did with great enthusiasm and with excellence and with good results. They all resulted in published chapters. And of course, I also have to mention, I mean, you gave me the thesis and put 2 pictures in there. A fun story and a unique experience for me in this journey. Literally, when you stayed at Arizona, I wanted to go there and kick off the project together with you. As Clemens will remember, that was in the week of the Super Bowl. So I couldn't find a hotel under $1,000 a night. And we decided to instead rent an RV and take a trip out of the town because, you know, the Super Bowl is crazy. So we went up to the Grand Canyon and saw the Grand Canyon in February in the snow. And that was, it's one of the highlights of my career. I don't know about you, but it's going to be hard to top for any PhD after you. The defense today, your many seminars, excellent track record as a tutor and educator. I think you have what it takes to become a very successful academic. I hope you will seriously consider that path. But whatever you choose, I think the set of skills you bring along will make you a success everywhere. So, Vinzenz, I think you've proven yourself to be an outstanding academic citizen, highly valued colleague. In the early days of your PhD, you started working on creating a digital network because of COVID, and when that failed or wasn't necessary anymore, you started having coffee with the rest of the PhDs here, ending up in your statements, actually. And I think that's a common theme for all MILE PhDs. So you're part of the community. We hate to see you go. We also are proud to see you go with this result. And let me conclude with congratulating you and Linda on a new start you've made in Bonn. I sincerely hope this diploma is not the end, but the beginning of a promising academic career and the continuation of a very pleasant collaboration. So, let me just finish by saying let's make some new devious plans in Varese in a few weeks, and I wish you all the best in your future. Thank you.
Thanks.
Dear Dr. Peters, also on behalf of School of Business and Economics of Maastricht University and of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree that you have acquired. What happens now? There is a reception. We will stay here for a photo moment together with the people who are online. Then we go outside for all the photo moments. So that's it for now, and herewith I close the session. If you want to address the people online, you can.
Thank you very much for joining online. Would have loved to see you all here, of course, but I can very well understand that was not possible.